G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going through my team selection for the Italian Grand Prix this coming weekend. So as always, if you're new around here, you're enjoying the F1 fantasy content, or you might not be enjoying F1 fantasy after the last weekend in Zandvoort, still drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Let's get straight into this absolutely catastrophic F1 fantasy weekend. For the Dutch Grand Prix, I had 162 points all out. And before we get into everything on screen here and how the weekend unfolded, I haven't prepared talking notes for this segment of the video. I intentionally want it to be raw, unfiltered emotion. And I think we can start at the top for what you see on screen here. Lando Norris minus 10. I don't know what to say with my F1 fantasy team anymore. I feel like a lot of these decisions at the time feel as though they're the right ones for my team, and then get to Sunday, it's absolutely gone in the toilet. So Lando, as if you watched the race, finished with minus 10 F1 fantasy points. He retired with about 7 laps to go. So thankfully not the full dreaded minus 20, but still not a great result regardless. Anyone that had the autopilot on a team like this feasted with Oscar Piastri. I say feasted, still a green arrow, I'm sure, but a pretty devastating red arrow for my team. Given the fact that up until his retirement, with the double Ferrari DNF, this lineup actually looked like it could have been a season, maybe not season defining, but certainly a turning point for my team. And I mean, I'm not going to harp on all day about the DNFs. They've been so overweight for so long, the minus 20 DNF penalty. This needs to be changed. It's just way too harsh. You're hoping other drivers and constructors DNF before your own assets actually score points. It's just counterintuitive, but I could talk for 50 hours about that. So look, it's been pretty harsh, especially for people that had Ferrari and got the minus 40 for the Hamilton and Leclerc retirements, albeit that Leclerc probably didn't deserve to retire after being knocked by Kimi. But quite frankly, definitely a disappointing weekend. I just feel like, and I'm sure many of you can relate to this, who had either this team or a team similar to this, or even the Ferrari constructor team, just feel like every time you turn a corner or you feel like you're making headway, something like this crops up and it absolutely stuffs up any plans you had. Going into the deadline, if you joined me for my deadline stream, there was a lot of talk around the wild card, and I still fully expect it's on the table for me in Italy. There are routes to non-wild card teams, but quite frankly, with how things shook out, whether or not Aston Martin are actually going to be competitive at a high-powered track, there's decisions that need to be made. Aside from Lando's obvious disappointment, Oscar Piastri, as we know, pole position, Grand Prix winner, fastest lap. He looked off the pace compared to Lando, which is not off the pace, but compared to Lando in free practice, Oscar didn't look quite as compelling, which was why I just thought, look, let's triple up on McLaren. Ferrari and Mercedes don't look with it. And Aston Martin had pretty decent single lap pace. So the triple ups were kind of my thought process heading into the deadline, which is what I landed on. But unfortunately, Stroll binned it in qualifying. Alonso finished P10 in qualifying. Yes, they had some great recovery drives, and I'm glad that the constructor ended up with 41 points, saved a little bit of my bacon, but that would not have happened if the Ferrari retirements, the Kimi Antonelli penalty, the George Russell kind of damage to his car didn't happen. And I fully expect that this is probably not going to be the case next weekend in Italy. So look, take the good with the bad. I think it was a solid weekend, but still a red arrow, a 1.6 million K rank drop. The 1K goal is certainly slipping further and further away. And yeah, at this point, 5K, I'd be happy with top 5K. So look, gained close to 3 million in budget. There's really not much more to say. It's a pretty disappointing weekend for the team. And even though the decisions I thought were the right ones, just didn't seem to pay off. So look, I'll just digest it. I'm definitely much better at processing results, but bad results for sure in F1 fantasy this season. But it's still a bit of a gut punch when something like this happens. So, let me know in the comments below how your team fared, because this is probably one of the harder done by teams. Anyone that had Ferrari probably also suffered a little bit. So 7.8K now in the world overall, down from 6.2, I think it was. We got a bit of a recovery to do. So hopefully 5K still within reach the further on in the season we get. Now, obviously, I talked about Ferrari and Lando Norris. We'll get to them in just a second. But some of the key takeaways from the weekend, I think you got to start with Isaac Hadjar. The Frenchman served up an incredible P3 result, his first podium. I'm ecstatic for him. Yes, he capitalized on the Norris retirement, but he did so well to defend Charles Leclerc. He took the battle to Max. I was really impressed by the rookie. He has had an incredible first 15 races to land on the podium after that length of time, especially after his result in Australia as well. Just goes to show what kind of talent he is. And quite honestly, I did not expect, I definitely thought Hadjar had a chance of having a solid weekend, albeit maybe not a spectacular one. But you fast forward to qualifying, that P4 result, then to finish on the podium. It probably, to me, I expected Hadjar to drop 0.6 to 4.5 million. In fact, he went quite the opposite way, all the way up to now, as you can see in the budget builder, 5.7 with that 33-point haul. I thought Hadjar would be a ready-made 4.5 option in Italy. Instead, he becomes a compelling budget building option for this race coming up. Minus 16 points for a max rise. If you're short on budget, I think you go out and get Hadjar for sure. Because of the fact Bortoleto, Alonso and Stroll, which we'll also talk about in a minute, don't need much for a price rise, there may not actually be a need for everyone to go out and buy Hadjar. But in saying that, I think he's still, as one of the top qualifiers, before the weekend, he's going to be even higher now. He was the best qualifier on the grid from the not big four teams. So quite honestly, you're getting a ready-made rookie driver, one with explosive fantasy upside, a great qualifier, and that Racing Bulls looks racy. Pardon the pun, please laugh. But really liking what I'm seeing from Hadjar, and I think becomes a great fantasy asset now and for the rest of the fantasy season. Now, we talked about Lando Norris retiring. I guess the rank drop was maybe alleviated a little bit because of that Ferrari double DNF. Most people were probably running the McLaren, Ferrari, Piastri, or the triple McLaren, triple Aston Martin build, or some combination of that. So if you escaped with none of these retirements, you should go and buy yourself a lottery ticket. I just think it was a weekend many people got hit for six. But if you had Norris and Ferrari, I'm speechless. I'm sorry. Like, that's just egregious luck. But goes to show that the double Ferrari DNF and Lando Norris, 3 top drivers all out on the same weekend, that never happens. So some of those fantasy scores we saw from midfield drivers meant, A, you're not probably going to see that every weekend, and B, makes them attractive budget building options for not just the upcoming race weekend, but for multiple race weekends. I am going to bring up the budget builder again. And as you can see on screen here, if you want to access F1 Fantasy Tools premium features, use the code HUB50 for 50% off your first month on their website. Details for that are in the description below. But I want to talk about the budget builder. We talked about Hadjar already. We're not going to go on him again. But I did mention that Bortoleto, Alonso, Stroll, all 3 assets I had in my team in Zandvoort, very much holds again for that low price rise threshold. Albon as well, 4 points. If we go further down the list, you've also got the likes of Colapinto, Esteban Ocon, and Oliver Behrman. Maybe not, I mean, you could go for Behrman in Italy as well. But the point I'm trying to make is, because these drivers all have very decent F1 fantasy scores from Zandvoort that will carry across for the next 3 race weekends, you've got your pick of the litter for potentially all very good budget building options. I don't think, to me, Monza's a super risky DNF track just because there's a lot of long straights, not many overtaking zones, except obviously into turn 1, and I think kind of further around. I off the top of my head, can't remember the turn, but on the back side of the circuit. But I guess what I'm saying is there's about half a dozen different assets in the midfield that you could consider for your team with these high scores in Zandvoort that will carry through the next 2 or 3 races, that will position these assets for price rises. So this might actually be a decent time to take a gamble on maybe an Esteban Ocon. Oliver Behrman obviously has that DNF from Hungary, but as soon as that drops off after Italy, he will have that 27 on his trailing average, which is the best score, excluding Hadjar, of course, and Albon, of the midfield drivers. So I think he becomes, if not in Monza, I don't know if 11 points is realistic for a Haas car, but again, happily proven wrong. I'm just thinking there are options on the table for us to choose from, and there may be, I know we've talked a lot about the 4A template shift. I don't know if even Monza is that time. Do we keep accruing value? I still think there are teams that can stretch to those 4As, but because as well Ferrari are off the table, if your focus is still a hybrid of points and budget, Ferrari perhaps isn't that option for your team. Maybe it's Mercedes instead. So there are a lot of different combinations we can consider because there are a lot of high-scoring midfield drivers in the Netherlands. So just something to think about, but it does open the door a little bit for a few different lineup selections. Alpine assets as well, another interesting one. So I didn't talk about them just then. Gasly has had back-to-back scores of 0 and 0, and Colapinto had his first double-digit score of the season in Zandvoort. These assets I fully expect will both be 4.5 by the time we get to after Monza. I mean, unless Gasly has a screamer and scores more than 8-9 points, and Colapinto scores more than 5, which I don't really think is going to happen. I fully expect these two $4.5 million assets will be the ones that enable the premium 4A lineups in the weeks to come. So just keep an eye on them. They've definitely been the weakest team lately. Colapinto had his best result of P11, but I still think he's inherently a DNF risk waiting to happen. So look, I'm not suggesting go out and buy them, but I do think if your team is stretched on budget, but you still want a piece of that 4A lineup now in Baku, in Singapore, then I do think they could be worth considering. The only thing I will say about Colapinto is Briatore did say in the lead up to qualifying on Thursday, Friday, I think it was, that Franco is really not up to scratch. And I think that's kind of ominous for whether or not he's in the car for the rest of the season. So maybe tread with caution. He could well be a transfer out of your team if he gets dropped from Alpine, but just something to keep in the back of your mind. And then the second constructor pick, it was a lottery in Zandvoort. I think it's going to be very much the same in Monza. We've got, as I said, Ferrari that needs 70-odd points for a 0.3 rise. Aston Martin, V-Carb looked great. Kicks solid. And then Mercedes, Kimi Antonelli just seems to be a risk. Yes, he had a result. I call it a result, 1 point in Zandvoort. But he didn't look like a very confident driver. He hit Leclerc and racked up a couple of time penalties. So Mercedes are a bit of a crapshoot too. Red Bull, I don't know if they look great. So maybe we run a B-tier constructor for another week. I'm fascinated by what that means for our fantasy teams. And that's probably a good segue into my early team thoughts for this weekend. I've left out transfers for this week because I do want to just talk about team combinations. But I think from what we've already talked about in the weekend notes, there are a number of different transfer targets for this weekend. So Oscar stays. Alonso probably stays. Bortoletto most likely stays. And McLaren definitely stays. Aston Martin, Stroll, and Lando Norris are all at risk, just simply because of their price points and whether or not I want to deviate from this current lineup, if that's the direction I choose to go for back to a Ferrari or a Mercedes for a premium constructor. Right now, I'm really not sure. I want to see practice, and if I do decide to shuffle 3 or 4 assets around, that's why I've got the wild card potentially in play. It's not active right now, but I do want to give myself some flexibility as to how I navigate the upcoming race weekend. So this is my team on screen here. I could potentially run it back something like this again. The problem is if I just quickly dip over to the budget builder, Lando needs at least 25 points for not the max price drop. I still think he can easily get to 26, but 54 on a non-sprint weekend seems very unrealistic. So if I stick with him for another week, it's probably just having to swallow the $0.1 million drop. Oscar Piastri is going nowhere. Stroll would have to make way just because of his price at 10 million. He's a terrible qualifier. Monza's not exactly super high overtakes. The Aston Martin seems to be better in the slower speed corners. So I do wonder if we see a bit of regression from them. Bortoletto would likely stay just because of his price. So if I don't go for something like this, look, I've got 2 transfers because I used 3 in the Netherlands. If I wanted to make one, what's my budget? 11.8. I can't quite get to Albon. I really like him. He's also done decently in Monza. I think Williams also just look like they're on par with the Aston Martins. I think Sainz had a really good shot until he had his race ruined by Liam Lawson in Zandvoort. So maybe we see a recovery from them. Interestingly, Williams had a decent weekend at the other Italian Grand Prix in Imola earlier in the season. So take that with a pinch of salt. But if I was to go slightly different, where do I start? Do I maybe go like a George Russell in and I don't know, upgrade one of these guys. It just seems a bit strange. I'd probably almost run this lineup similarly. Could I get Williams potentially? I'm not saying this is a must do path, but I could maybe consider something like this. If I went down the Williams path, I could get Hadjar in. I don't mind this at all. But realistically, I think I'd probably, if I don't go down this route, the premium constructor with McLaren. Let's start with Mercedes. So this would be 2 transfers. I wouldn't need to take a hit. I actually have to keep Stroll. Where are you? Okay, so you're here. 2 transfers, Lando and Aston Martin. Out, Mercedes, and I would say Alex Albon potentially in. That leaves a little bit of money on the side. That's the one thing I'm fearful of. But there's no one else really at that price. Kimi Antonelli, I'm just not encouraged by at all. So I could do this. 2 moves, not the end of the world. Alternatively, a 3rd transfer would probably be meaning to either take Stroll out, and where does that leave me? Like Ferrari, I guess. I could do something like that, but they're likely to fall in value, so I'm not overly confident. I mean, that would again mean leaving probably Stroll in just for the value upside. But that's technically 2 trades, but again, probably having to eat the Ferrari price drop. But Albon's budget upside isn't bad at all. 4 points for Max Rise, I think, is definitely attainable. He's looked great this season. If we just go over to the statistics page, he's been one of the most consistent midfield options this season. Aside from that 3-race streak of DNFs between Spain and Austria, he's had double-digit points in all but 2 races. So Japan, 8 points, also not a high overtake track. And then Monaco, again, 4 points, another low overtake track. You look at every other track on the calendar, Albon has scored double-digit points removing the DNF. So really liking that consistency from him, a great qualifier. He was disappointed with his qualifying result in Zandvoort, but I think that was a matter of more the team's fault than his own. And then you look at, let's say, a differential option in Red Bull. I don't know necessarily if this is the right path to go down, but it just feels like these are 2 obvious trades to me. I just don't feel as though there are many other options on the table. We've talked about Williams. We've talked about Aston Martin, like 31 points. It's really Norris who I would have to keep in this slot. Unless I decide to just cycle out one of the budget drivers. I am 0.1 short for Isaac Hadjar, but I could do Liam Lawson. He looked all right. I just feel like that's a sideways trade. But again, early team thoughts. I'll probably have a bit more of a pointed perspective by the time we get to free practice. So I'm going to leave that there for now, guys. Lots of options on the table, which I think is an exciting thing for F1 Fantasy, but a pretty gut-wrenching weekend in the Netherlands for anyone that had Lando Norris as their 2X or Ferrari as their constructor. So as I said at the start of the video, if you enjoy the content, if you want to just pour one out because you had an absolutely disgusting F1 Fantasy score, please let me know down in the comments below. I'll be back later in the week, potentially for my final thoughts, if not definitely the deadline stream on the Saturday. So enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Have a great week ahead, and I will see you all very soon.